Welcome everyone to the Conflict Free Kansas Grant Pre-Bid Conference. We can go ahead and advance to the next slide. You're joined here today with a handful of folks from my team, myself, Heather Fladmark, as the lead grant manager, Madison Sebular, who is our grant support, Peter Busby, who is our grant communication, and Caroline Hockenberry, sorry, Caroline, grants communication as well. You'll be hearing from the four of us throughout today's presentation. We do have some other folks on the call to support the conversation today, but I'm going to turn it over to Seth to do your introduction and welcome.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for kind of taking time out of your days to be here and hear about this conflict-free grant. I'm sure you wouldn't be here if you hadn't been kind of paying attention to a little bit of what's going on around this issue. Surrounding conflicts of interest and our HCBS system, and kind of wanting to really move our system in a way that's compliant with CMS rules and regulations, but also is preserving kind of the core function of HCBS, which is really supposed to be kind of that person-centered system. And we want to make sure that the structures and policies and systems and entities that we have in place are really set up to support kind of that HCBS core philosophy. So again, thank you so much for being here and hearing about this. And so I'm gonna kick it back over to PCG.
Great, thanks, Seth. So for today's agenda, we will be going over PCG's role, talking a little bit about the grant program and giving you an overview of that. We will talk about the eligible and ineligible expenses, the grant application, and then we'll wrap up today with any questions that you all may have regarding the grant program. So first we'll talk about PCG's role. Why are we here? Public Consulting Group is a public sector consulting firm that works with health, education, and human services agencies. We have been contracted with Kansas Department for Aging and Disability Services, also known as KDADS, to help with administering the Conflict Free Kansas grant. So what we will be doing is supporting the development of the grant program and related materials, supporting the application review, issuing the notification of grant award, which is also known as the NOGA, collect reimbursement requests, and then issue those payments to qualified applicants who meet the grant's goal. So we will go over and review and kind of a high level overview of the grant program. So starting out is, where to read the RFA. The RFA will be located on the Conflict Free Kansas grant webpage. We do encourage everybody that is interested in applying in reading the RFA as a whole. This presentation is a high level summary. So you may not get all of the information today. However, the RFA is available for you to read some of the most important information in the RFA that we may not be able to cover today. The next piece is we're going to talk a little bit about the purpose of the Conflict Free Kansas grant and what this program was developed for. So first, starting out is to maximize service receiving individuals' confidence and trust in their service and support plans. And then secondarily, ensuring statewide compliance with federal regulations by helping community developmental disability organizations, community service providers, and targeted case management agencies eliminate those conflicts of interest. This is all driven by the HCBS settings final rule. So the final rule, which was developed and published by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services in 2014. This requires the separation of direct service provision and targeted case management. When an organization handles both at once, a conflict of interest is as a result. So Kansas must eliminate that conflict of interest to satisfy that federal requirement. So let's talk a little bit about why must this work be done? How does this affect Kansas? Starting out with a huge priority is to protect that Medicaid funding. About 60% of Kansas Medicaid funding comes from the federal government. So if Kansas does not address this existing conflict of interest, the state could lose that federal funding. And without that federal funding, Kansas would have to cut services or serve fewer people with that limited funding than available just by the state. To create the new community supports waiver is another reason why this work must be done. As you all know, there is a wait list for the IDD waiver services in Kansas, which is why, and a huge reason why Kansas has wanted to develop this community supports waiver, which would support individuals who do not need that 24-hour support. But in order to do this, Kansas needs approval from CMS, and Kansas has identified that they will not approve new waivers until states address that conflict of interest. Next is to ensure individuals trust the HCBS system. So most likely, neither case managers nor providers act unethically despite that conflict of interest. However, that existence of conflict of interest is enough to create doubts in minds of service receiving individuals. So only if conflict of interests are eliminated can individuals be 100% sure providers have their best interest in mind. And this last box here is to really point out that we want to keep providers eligible. So the final rule from CMS states that, among other things, that HCBS providers cannot also offer case management. All providers need to follow that final rule. So any providers that still have that conflict of interest might not be eligible to enroll as a provider in the state of Kansas. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the application guideline. This grant program is to support providers in separating their IDD direct services from their TCM agency and CDDO functions. So what does this mean? This means that CSPs, or community support providers, would deliver only direct IDD waiver services, and CDDOs would be allowed to maintain their TCM functions if they currently have them, or acquire TCM functions if they don't currently have them. Eligible applicants can use funds to separate that direct service provision from any CDDO or TCM. And this also is to help establish new conflict-free TCM agencies to serve individuals who are maybe already being served by an agency with that conflict of interest. Applications must propose to use this grant funds in a manner that drives organizations towards compliance. We did provide here also that there are a few resources on our Conflict Free Kansas webpage that help kind of lay out that rule a little bit more. So we do encourage you to visit that webpage for additional information. Lastly, and we'll point this out a few times today, you must submit your application through the online portal by Monday, April 28th at 5 p.m. Next slide. So who are the eligible applicants? Who can apply for this grant? And I'll quickly go through this, but the eligible applicants would be CDDOs that currently provide HCBS IDD waiver services and propose to use this grant or these grant funds to stop providing those IDD waiver services. CDDOs that currently do not provide TCM and propose to use the grant funds to start a TCM arm or acquire a TCM arm from another agency. HCBS IDD waivers DSPs that currently provide TCM and propose to use the grant funds to stop providing that TCM service. TCM agencies that do not also provide IDD waiver services that propose to use the grant funds to provide TCM services to individuals currently served by an agency with a conflict of interest. And then lastly, individuals or organizations that propose to use grant funds to start a new TCM agency to serve individuals currently served by an agency with a conflict of interest. An important note for this one is that individuals or organizations that would be interested in starting an agency would be required to submit a letter of support from their CDDO or a proof of affiliation with a CDDO. So again, some important dates for everyone to keep in mind. Questions, any questions that you all have either during this webinar or after are due by that April 1st date. We then will post responses to all of those questions by April 8th. And that, again, those applications are due April 28th by 5 p.m. Central Time. We anticipate award letters to be distributed by June 1st, and that the grant period is to start on July 1. An important note here is that all documents must be signed in order for an agency to start that spending. The grant period does end December 31st of 2025, and that final reimbursement request would be due January 31st of 2026. A big important note for this particular grant program is that it is exclusively through reimbursement. Grantees must incur or pay for those expenses first and then submit a reimbursement request. There will be no prospective payments for this program. Expenses will be reimbursed directly to the individual or organization that incurred or paid for them. Only individuals and organizations that apply and sign that NOGA, that Notice of Grant Agreement, will be reimbursed. Grantees must expend all grant funds by Wednesday, December 31st, and then they will have until Saturday, January 21st, 2026, to compile proof of spending and submit that reimbursement request. All right, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Madison to go over eligible and ineligible expenses.
Great, thank you, Heather. Hi, everyone, it's good to be with you today. Like Heather said, I'm going to be covering our eligible and ineligible expenses for the grant program today. Heather mentioned this in some previous slides about what eligible applicant types there are for this grant program. For this first slide, we are going to be going over the eligible expenses for all of those provider types, all of those applicant types who can apply to this grant program. I also do just want to note here, for the sake of length for this presentation, we didn't include the full descriptions of these eligible expenses on the slide. They are included in the request for application, the RFA that was released on Monday. So if you need more detail on these expenses, you can absolutely go to the RFA and look there. But for now, what we have on the screen are the subcategory expenses. These are the titles that are included in the budget detail spreadsheet, which we will discuss a little bit later in this presentation. I do also want to mention that these are the activities that, if your organization is eligible for them, can receive grant funding, so long as these activities are related to the goals of the Conflict-Free Kansas grant. So I want to just put that out there. Keep in mind that none of these expenses can be funded or will receive funding if they don't relate to those goals. So to get started on this, these eligible expenses for all applicant types include meeting with business consultants, obviously about becoming conflict-free, communicating with the public about becoming conflict-free, any translation services, for example, from English to another language or plain language about becoming conflict-free is also eligible. We also have moving to a new commercial location, up to $5,000 can be requested. Again, so that moving to a new location in order to become conflict-free. Our next one there, purchasing signage to advertise your new conflict-free agency, up to $4,000. And then we also have external training for staff on topics such as HCBS settings final rule, any person-centered planning, training such as those. And then finally, we have training stipends for staff up to $50 per training and a total of $250 per staff member. So we'll go ahead and go on to a little bit more nuance here. So again, referring back to those applicant types, there are 5 different ones. Not all of the applicant types are eligible for the remaining subcategory of expenses for this grant. So I will go through these quickly. Hopefully, again, like I said, you can refer to the table that is in the RFA for more detail if you need that. So I'll go through these one by one. Staff time to create and or revise policy documents. That's an eligible expense for new TCMs. Hiring of a consultant or subcontractor to revise policy documents is eligible for all applicant types except for new TCMs. Then we go on to hiring up to $1,000 per hire, as well as retention bonuses up to $2,000 per hire. Those would be for those applicant types that are going to be hiring. So any CDDOs who are looking to start a new TCM arm, any non-conflicted TCM agencies, as well as any new TCM agencies. We have applying for a new business entity or ownership and fees for a new licensure. So this would be for our new agencies like the new TCMs, as well as those CDOs who are creating a new TCM arm. And then finally on the slide, we have business development training up to $7,000. So that would be to support those new TCM agencies. Moving along, we have some consultation to go from an agency with a conflict to a conflict-free agency. So those would be our applicant types that are currently in conflict. So those CDDOs in conflict or CSPs in conflict. The next one would be consultation to start a new conflict-free agency, and that would be up to $12,500. Those would be for our CDDOs with new TCM as well as new TCMs. Then we have our deposits for utility bills and costs for utilities up to 3 months for a commercial building. That would be for non-conflicted TCMs as well as new TCMs. And then for those last 2, leasing new office space for a conflict-free agency, as well as a deposit for first and last month's rent for a new commercial building. That would be eligible for all of the applicant types except for CSPs in conflict. Similarly, we have rent for up to 3 months of a new commercial building. That would be eligible for all applicant types except for CSPs in conflict. For funds to terminate an existing lease to secure a new location, that would be for CDDOs with a new TCM, CSPs in conflict, and non-conflicted TCMs. And then for those next 3, job postings and recruitment fees for new TCM staff, implementation fees for new TCM software, protective devices or plans for hardware or software up to 15% of the purchase price. That would be eligible for all 3 of those would be eligible for CDDOs with new TCM, non-conflicted TCMs, and new TCMs. And then we have equipment to help create a new agency, and that would be just eligible for our CDDOs with new TCM as well as our new TCMs. And finally, on our last slide here, we have software costs. Software, so that would be something such as case management software, time tracking software, billing software to support TCM functions. So that would be eligible for CDDOs with new TCM, any non-conflicted TCMs, as well as our new TCMs. And then those last few eligible expenses, the internal training on policies and procedures, facilitator costs, books, manuals, and other resources to enhance the skills of workforce, as well as renting spaces for training sessions if in-house facilities are not available, and training-related travel costs, again, refer to the RFA for more detail. Those would all be eligible expenses just for our new TCM applicants. We'll move along to our ineligible expenses here. What I'd like to say is that we have these ineligible expenses include but are not limited to the following lists that we have on these slides. And I just officially want to say that KDADS may reject in whole or in part any applications with any of these impermissible, excuse me, expenses. So just to run through these ineligible expenses, again, to reiterate, these are for all of our applicant types here, would be any expenses unrelated to the goals of the grant, any costs that supplant or replace existing funding or functions, any costs incurred outside of the grant period, any pre-existing debts of any kind, reimbursement for activities already covered by Medicaid, any lobbying or political activities, any entertainment, including social activities and related costs, care, personal supplies, food, or equipment for individuals receiving services, any capital expenditures unrelated to the specific program, any marketing materials to retain clients for the organization, any costs related to hiring temporary staff, any costs related to onboarding and screening, any home office expenses or transportation expenses, employee benefits, and finally, equipment given to employees or individuals receiving services for permanent use. And I will hand it, I believe, over to my colleague Caroline to go over the first part of our grant application with you all.
Thank you so much, Madison. I'm going to talk a little bit about the application itself that we will have you all submit online through the platform JotForm. So as I just mentioned, we have this online portal called JotForm where you will be submitting, and applications are due by Monday, April 28th at 5 p.m. Central Time. An important note is that you can't change your application once you submit it, so you want to be sure that you read over your responses carefully and make sure that everything is answered correctly before you turn it in. What do you do if you have some questions? First of all, you can email us at conflictfreekansas@pcgus.com with those questions. You can also call this number here on the screen between 8 and 5 Central Time, Monday through Friday, for some answers. If you have questions on the grant program, such as what counts as eligible activities, what funding amounts are, etc., you can send those in to that email address above by Tuesday, April 1st at 5 p.m. And then we will post all answers to those questions a week later on the Conflict Free Kansas website. And I'll have someone drop that link in the chat for you all so you have it handy. But we will do that by 5 p.m. on Tuesday, April 8th. But applicants can ask any questions about JotForm and the online application, such as if you have any questions about access or you're experiencing some functionality issues, you can reach out to us until the grant period deadline. So this is what the main application screen looks like. You see the name of the grant up there, the due date of April 14th at 5 p.m. Central Time, and a reminder that applicants can only submit one application per National Provider Identifier or NPI number, no matter how many sites your organization operates. These two buttons in the bottom right corner are going to be really important. You have the next button, which you're going to use to advance through the different steps of the application, and the save button, which you will want to hit regularly to make sure your data is maintained. The second page will present some application instructions. You'll learn how to save your application by creating a JotForm account. You'll find out about receiving an access link so that you can return to your saved application, so you'll want to keep that handy. But no worries, because you'll also be able to find these on our website, the Conflict Free Kansas website, at the grant FAQ and application guide, which will be uploaded as an attachment. The next step will be selecting your organization type. These are the 5 types that Heather mentioned earlier, the 2 types of CDDOs, CSP, TCM agency, or a new individual or organization proposing to start a new TCM agency. And in this step, you simply bubble in one of the following, but it's going to be important that you put down the right one for you. Next, you'll have a series of administrative questions to answer. You'll need to provide the name of your organization, include your NPI number, include the contact information for a secondary contact, as well as contact information for the individual signing the contract and a financial staffer. There's a W-9 tax portion of this application as well. So here you will enter your legal business entity name, pick your federal tax classification, and then as you can see in the second screenshot, you're going to download the current IRS W-9, which will be unfilled. You're going to want to complete that and re-upload it to the Dropbox place, also outlined in the second screenshot. There will also be a series of questions for new and existing agencies. So for new agencies, you'll need to speak to whether you followed the guidelines in Article 63. You want to name the counties that your agency intends to serve. How many individuals does your organization plan to serve in FY25? Have you done any communications or marketing so far? And what is your funding source? For existing agencies, you will want to explain the preparation that you've done so far to eliminate COIs or conflicts of interest at your organization. You'll want to explain how your organization has been impacted by the final rule. How many staff will no longer be able to work at your agency? What are your plans to provide CDDO or TCM functions at your organization? You will spell out your project timeline, as well as any potential risks you may experience while fulfilling your project. There's also a series of priority criteria, so you'll want to mark if any of these apply to you. Do you plan to increase services to additional counties, at least one being rural and non-metro in the state of Kansas? Do you plan to expand to a new service area, whether by increasing staff, providing services to a new service area, or increasing the number of people served in these areas? And if you're not expanding to a new service area, then your proposal increases services to additional individuals. If any of these apply to you, please be sure to mark it so that you are considered for these priorities. Next, I'm going to hand it off to Madison to discuss the budget portion of the application.
Thanks, Caroline. All right, so I know I covered eligible and ineligible expenses a little bit earlier in this presentation. So those categories, those subcategories that we talked about earlier, those fall under our categories that are listed here. So these are our main categories. That would be administrative costs, business development, conflict-free consultations, marketing and communication, moving costs, new space, training, and training stipends. So those are the main categories that those eligible expenses we talked about earlier fall under. We'll go to the next slide. I will say the budget is completed and kind of in 2 steps. So we have an Excel workbook, which we call the budget details spreadsheet. So there you can see a screenshot of what some of that would look like. We have that component that you would fill out, and then that helps you to answer the online application part of the budget questions for that. So it's important to fill out that Excel workbook. That gives you the answers to what to put into the online portal application. And this isn't on the slide, but I'd like to make a disclaimer here that when you open the Excel workbook, it will populate a question up top in the top ribbon. It'll ask you to enable macros. Since this is a trusted source, you're getting it right from PCG in the state. you can enable those macros. It's a trusted document. You have to do that in order for the workbook to work. So the second really important thing about the budget spreadsheet here is that you need to select what type of applicant you are. So you have to select one of those 5 applicant types we discussed earlier. You can see on the screen there is a yellow box. That's where you are selecting your agency. You just click on that box, you select from the dropdown which applicant type you are, and then from there it'll populate your main categories of expenses. So what we talked about on the previous slide. That even further populates when you click into those category tabs, what eligible subcategory expenses your applicant type is eligible for. So very important to select your organization type here because it sets up the rest of the workbook for success. So just wanting to highlight that. And we can go on to our next slide. Another item we want to call out here is our indirect costs. So indirect costs is, again, both in the online application for the budget as well as our budget detail spreadsheet. Really wanting to emphasize here that every grantee that is filling this out is automatically going to be given an additional 10% to cover any indirect costs. And this reimbursement for indirect costs cannot exceed $25,000 over the lifetime of the grant period. If applicants are wanting to receive that indirect cost payment, they have to track all of those indirect costs. Now, if you do not want to have indirect costs included in your grant total, you would just go over to the tab in your budget detail spreadsheet Excel workbook and just toggle that item, that question from yes to no, and then it would be removed from your grant total budget there. So just wanting to highlight that. Also wanting to say too, that it is important once you finish your budget detail spreadsheet, save that because that will be included in one of the attachments that you need to submit with your online application. And with that, I'll hand it back to Caroline to talk about the rest of those attachments.
Thank you, Madison. I will walk us through the last few steps of the application. Here's the attachment portion we were discussing. So the budget details spreadsheet, as you can see on the left in the first item, it will go here in this Dropbox area. Also, if you are classified as number 5, which is the organization or individual creating a new TCM agency, here's where you would submit a letter of support from the CDDO or proof of affiliation with the CDDOs in that next Dropbox area. In addition to those required documents, any supplemental materials that you would like considered with your application can be dropped in this section. You'll just need to fill out a text box with a brief description of all of the attached documents so that reviewers know exactly what we're looking at. As for completing your application, as mentioned on the last slide, you'll want to list all other information that you think KDADs should know when considering your application. As a submitter, you'll want to include your contact information. You'll need to attest that all of the information that you've put into your application is correct. You also need to acknowledge that you can't edit your application after you submit it, so make sure you do that final check to ensure accuracy. Then you sign and date your submission and you're finished. Once you complete your application, you'll be sent an email confirmation, and within that you will have a PDF of everything that you put into your submission. If for some reason you don't get that email, please reach out to us at the email shared earlier in this presentation. It's also mentioned on the website before the grant deadline, and we'll work with you. Finally, we just want you to be aware of what the error banner looks like. So here on the left in the screenshot, you can see in red that a pop-up will appear and it will give you a count of how many errors are on a given page. You can click See Errors to look through them one by one. They'll be surrounded, outlined in red, and you can click through them in order to address them. But these must be satisfied in order for you to submit. All right, I'm going to hand it off to Peter Busby now, my colleague, to go through some Q&A with you.
Thank you, Caroline. So it looks like we have about 20 minutes or so for Q&A, and we are more than happy to use that whole 20 minutes. So please do submit any questions you have. I will say we've seen a few people adding questions to the chat. We just ask that if possible, you do add them to the Q&A tab instead, just because it's easier for us to keep track of which questions have been answered. And if we need to review questions later on, it's a lot easier for us to pull them from the Q&A than it is for us to pull from the chat. So like I said, just add them there if you can. With that said, we have answered a few questions already. So if you submitted a question, please do check to see if it has been answered. But from now on, we will just sort of move through them as they come. So Heather, I'm going to start with you. I think this is one that we can answer, and then maybe we'll throw a few to KDADs for their help after that. But this one comes from an anonymous attendee asking if an organization has to move to a new location to be eligible if they plan to decouple from their CSP in every other aspect.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thanks, Peter. That is a bit of a complex response. This really falls back on the fiduciary relationship with those agencies. So as an example, if the CSP was the owner of that building and they wanted to rent the space out to a targeted case management agency, whether that was their previous affiliated agency or another, they would be required to have a lease with that agency that runs at market value. So I, as the owner, couldn't lease my building to Peter for $1. It would have to run at that lease market value for that type of space.
Thank you, Heather. At this point, like I said, we'll try to rely on KDADs for a few of these perhaps. We'll start with a question from the chat. This is from Lance Van Kooten, asking more or less, why are these grants being offered now? Would it be better to wait until we're sort of further along in planning for dealing with these conflicts of interest? So Lance, I will say up front, before we pass to KDADs, that one reason is that this is when funding is available, and we want to make sure, we provide as much support to y'all as we possibly can. In the future, who knows what funding will be available. So we're trying to do as much as we can in the moments we can. Megan, I'll rely on you from KDADs if you'd have anything you'd like to add there.
Yeah, I would just say that these funds come from the American Rescue Plan Act dollars that we received for a lot of the initiatives KDADS is working on. So they're time-limited funds. We only have them through the end of this calendar year. So we want to utilize them to help, come into compliance with the conflict of interest as well as the other work streams. So that's why they're not being offered later, and they're just currently being offered now.
Thank you, Megan. While I have you, I'm going to rely on you for a couple more as well. This is a question from Krista Jones. If IDD providers who want to divest their CDDO designation can apply for the funds.
I believe this is yes, but Robin, can you help me with this one?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Megan. I believe so. You'd have to look up the whole setup, but yes, if you have a provider, a CSP that's wanting to divest their CDDO to become conflict-free, then yes. And then do you mind if I add something to the question regarding why are we doing funding now?
Yeah, please.
Megan answered. I totally agree with what Megan said. I would just add that while we are going through some additional stakeholder meeting and discussions on viability of certain ways in which Kansas can become conflict-free, there are certain ways that we know for sure that will get us to conflict-free. So again, there's some things we're discussing for nuances, yet we know for sure that there are some ways to become conflict free. And we're trying to utilize this short-term funding in order to, get out the gate, so to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. A sort of related question from Andrea about sort of completing the application when, we haven't quite have sort of like a final decision on practices and procedures. I imagine, Robin or Megan, that's sort of a similar answer in that, we know the general shape this is taking. So we imagine you can come up with a plan based on that. Would you say that's accurate, or is there anything you'd like to add there?
I'd say that's accurate, yeah.
Heather, I'll give KDADS a break now, and I'll throw a few to you. I think we can answer based on the RFA.
Yeah, sure.
This one's from, well, let me make my blanket. I should have said this earlier. If I mispronounce anyone's name today, of course, I'm not doing it on purpose. So please just forgive me. But this one's from Sally Byers, asking if there's a dollar range we anticipate funding.
Yeah, that's also a great question. Thanks, Sally. We do not have a range for this program. So if you put together a request, please send it our way. We will determine what is eligible and then what funding we can allow based on the number of applicants and the bucket of funding that we have to work from.
Thank you, Heather. We've also received a few questions about the due date. I will just confirm it is April 28th by 5 p.m. So you'll see that on the website. You'll see that on the RFA. Perhaps there was an older screenshot in the presentation, but I will confirm it is due the 28th. A question from Angie Ranking about how rural urban is defined. You will see that it is in the RFA. There's also an attachment on the website. This is under useful resources at the bottom. It's attachment E, Kansas OMB Rural and Urban County Map. That'll provide more information for you about what qualifies as urban, what qualifies as rural. A question from Eileen about the relationship between CDDOs and TCM. So I'll just leave this open to whoever PCG or KDADS can answer it. But this is regarding sort of if CDDOs provide quality oversight to TCMs, if a TCM starting a if a CDDO starting a TCM arm would also qualify as a conflict of interest. So we'll start there.
And Peter, I can quickly jump in before KDAD adds to it. Per the federal regulation, in the conflict of interest, the one that we are referencing today, this is not identified as a conflict of interest. So nothing from our perspective on this grant program would that be an issue, but I'll let Megan kind of jump in there.
Yeah, I think I would have to take a look at that, but I rely on your expertise, Heather, but I would say that we can flesh that out in the RFA questions a little bit more, because I need to maybe think on that a little bit.
Excellent. Then yeah, Eileen, we'll take this one back. And this goes for everybody. We're going to use questions today, especially ones we don't get to update the FAQ. So if there's any we don't answer, any we don't reach, be confident you will get an answer down the line when we post that.
This is Robin. Do you mind if I just jump in real fast on that? And yeah, what I think Heather said, of course, I'm sure that's accurate. I just wanted to add part of why we were going down that road was because there was quite a bit of outcry on TCM capacity. And that was a way to help mitigate that. So really, we were concerned with TCM capacity, essentially, and people not having their TCM. So that's another reason to kind of roll in there. And that's all. Thank you.
Madison, this one actually might be most appropriate for you. I think this is about the budget spreadsheet. So an anonymous attendee is asking if they are currently a CSP, CDDO, and TCM sort of all together, what category would they fall under in that budget spreadsheet?
That's a great question, and I will ask my colleagues to weigh in on this as well. But from my understanding, it would just depend on how your organization is planning to mitigate that conflict of interest. So if you are a CSP who is looking to, break away from the CDDO and TCM arms of the agency, you would likely be a CSP in conflict. Heather, does that make sense? Do you have anything additional to add to that?
Nope, I think you got it. Thanks, Madison.
Sure thing.
We also have a few questions about the dollar limit. Again, just to sort of reiterate Heather's earlier point, we don't have a maximum limit that you can request. We also don't have sort of recommendations for the various categories, like, you should request X for marketing and communications. That being said, there are certain categories with more specific funding guidelines that apply only to those categories. So as we've said throughout, we encourage you to review the RFA to make sure you're abiding by those. Okay, Megan, I think we referred to this a little bit earlier, but it might be good to get back to it. This is a question again about ARPA funds. And if you've received any, communication regarding ARPA funds, about how they might be, limited or adjusted by CMS and how that might affect this particular grant.
At this time, we have not heard anything regarding the ARPA fundings from CMS. Obviously, we will continue to monitor that and let you all know if anything changes.
A question from Hazel regarding if this is, if the grant is for new providers as well. Hazel, I imagine that depends what you mean by new providers. So as we mentioned, you can use grant funds to start a new TCM agency. And if you are already a community service provider, let's say you just got your license or some such, you would also be eligible. I don't believe there's any requirements for longevity. But Heather, I'll throw the last bit to you. Could you use grant funds to become a CSP?
Yeah, great question. At this time, the grant program is structured for only new TCM providers.
A question from Vanessa Wiley about NPI numbers. So I believe she's correct in saying that only one application is allowed per NPI number, but they are a CDO connected to a CSP who does TCM. So they're asking if they can apply for grants for both functions, CDO separating from CSP and TCM separating from CSP. So sort of establishing three different branches. Heather, I don't know if this gets to our earlier answer from the budget categories question, but is there any more specific guidance we could provide here?
I'll actually turn that over to Bree and Rachel.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Heather. Rachel here from the finance team. It might be helpful, Peter, if we can take this one back and include in some of our responses. Thank you.
No problem. Vanessa, then as we said, we'll make sure you get an answer in the Q&A. As we said, we're going to take all questions back and use them to update our guidance materials. Forgive me, I'm just reading some of the questions now. Some of them are rather long. Heather, I'm just going to make sure I have this completely right. An NPI number is required to apply, correct?
It is, yes.
Thank you. So anonymous attendee, we saw your question. Obviously, we want everybody to be able to apply, but you will need that NPI number in order to do so. Megan, this one's most likely for you. if there's any sort of timeline on when this separation has to occur. So I know at the very least, we want to get things moving for two very important reasons. One, to protect Kansas's Medicaid funding, and two, in order to submit the CSW, which KDADS is presently working on, and the timeline right now projects to go to CMS sometime this fall. So I know there are two very big considerations with respect to the timeline, but is there anything else you'd like to add there?
No, I don't have anything to add. Yeah, those are good milestones that we want to reach, to help. And that's why we have to have, the conflict of interest issue mitigated. So we don't have a timeline, but, we're working internally to develop one, and we'll be messaging that information out as soon as we get more of it as we work with stakeholders.
Thank you, Heather. Or excuse me, not Heather. I apologize. I'm asking Heather next. Thank you, Megan. So Heather, this is a question from Travis Chapman about the sort of reporting, and I would say possibly the auditing process. So I know we have some things about reporting, sort of what happens after applications in the RFA. Do you know sort of offhand, a quick summation of that? Or is our best move to just refer Travis to that section of the RFA?
Yeah, I think referring Travis back to the RFA to get a more detailed response.
Perfect. Then Travis, as Heather said, we would recommend you go read that RFA. It is available on the webpage. And once you go through that, if you have some more specific questions that aren't answered there, we encourage you to send them through the email address we provide on the website. So with that, I think I'll bump over to the chat just for a moment to see if there are any in there. Again, as I said, I encourage everybody to add them in the Q&A. That is the simplest way for you to get a response. This question, Megan, again, this one's probably most appropriate to you. I imagine this gets to that ARPA question, but this is a question from Ben Woodworth about if the funds are at risk of a possible federal clawback. I believe this is something we covered as well in the New Day presentation earlier this week.
Right, correct. I mean, again, we have not received any information from CMS about pulling those federal funds back at this time, but we are monitoring our communication and we'll message that out if things change.
Thank you, Megan. Heather, I'm going to rely on you for this next one, I believe. This one's a question from Sherry Coatney. If TCM services need to separate from just other licensed services, or if they would also have to separate from non-licensed services such as FMS.
Yeah, so that licensing question, I do not have an answer for. So I would like to bring that back and provide a better answer. I think the answer that comes to mind immediately is, again, it goes back to that fiduciary relationship. If you're just separating your licenses, it doesn't meet the conflict of interest need. You have to look at the agency as a whole. So separating your agencies is different than just separating your license numbers. And how you're licensed, it goes back to, do you have the same board? Do you have the same executive team? Do you share financial relationships? So we'll be able to provide a more detailed response, but you have to look at the agency as a whole and not just your licensing numbers.
And Angie, I see your note about the maps on the attachment. We will make sure we give as precise guidance as we can to clarify sort of how those should be deployed in the FAQ. And then Debbie, I see your question about sort of how decisions were made from in between sort of what's allowable for CDDOs and what's allowable for CSPs. You know, sort of why certain expenses are available for some and not available for others. I don't think that's something we can cover in, you know, our time right now, especially as we approach the end here. You know, we only have sort of 3 minutes. I appreciate you waiting patiently for that answer, and I ask you to just be patient for a little while longer. I will make sure you get an answer to that in the FAQ. Just trying to see if there's any available. I believe we are sort of at time. We only have 2 minutes left. I see there are very many questions remaining in the chat that unfortunately, or excuse me, in the Q&A that unfortunately we're not going to be able to get to. But as we said, we have all of these recorded. We will make sure they get added to our FAQ document. You do not need to resubmit any of them. And when those answers get posted, we will let you all know so you can see them. But we appreciate all this engagement. We invite you to continue to engage through the website and the contact lists if you have other questions you weren't able to submit right now. So with that, I will send things back to Heather, who will close it down and send us home.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Peter. I also want to extend a thank you to everyone who participated in today's conversation. Again, we encourage you to go to the Kansas Conflict-Free website to get additional information, to read through that RFA as a whole, and please do send in those questions by April 1st so we can provide some additional questions. But again, thank you for engaging with us today. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we look forward to continuing these conversations with you all.